What happens when the heir to the city's most ruthless crime syndicate lives in absolute silence? Leo was the mafia boss's untouchable son, isolated by a deafness he believed was an incurable birth defect. His family thought his silence made him weak. His enemies thought it made him an easy target. But everything changed when a new maid walked into his quarters and pulled out an object that shattered his silent world forever. You won't believe what she was hiding. The Moretti estate sat like a brooding fortress on the cliffs of Long Island, a sprawling mansion of dark stone, wrought iron and secrets. It was the nerve center of Vincent Moretti's empire. Vincent was a man who ruled the eastern seaboard's underground with an iron fist and a calculating mind. He controlled the ports, the illegal casinos, and the underground trade networks. But for all his power, Vincent harbored a profound, agonizing vulnerability, his only son and heir, Leo Moretti. Leo was 26 years old, possessing his father's sharp jawline, piercing dark eyes, and imposing physical presence. Yet a thick, impenetrable wall of silence separated Leo from the criminal empire he was supposed to inherit. According to the family law, Leo had been born profoundly deaf, a tragic genetic anomaly that no amount of Vincent's blood money could cure. In the cutthroat world of the mafia, weakness was a death sentence. A don who could not hear the whispered conspiracies of his capos, the click of a safety being disengaged, or the subtle inflections of a liar's voice was a don who would not survive his first year. Because of this, Leo was kept in a gilded cage. He lived a life of luxurious isolation in the estate's west wing, guarded by men who treated him more like a fragile piece of porcelain than the future head of the family. Leo had adapted, of course. He was a master of lip-reading and American Sign Language. He learned to read a room not by the volume of the voices, but by the shifting of weight, the darting of eyes, and the vibrations of heavy footsteps on the hardwood floors. He was brilliant observant and deeply frustrated. He knew his uncle Oliver Moretti viewed him with thinly veiled contempt. He knew his cousin Anthony mocked him when they thought he wasn't looking. But without hearing the exact words, Leo could never prove their treachery to his father. Enter Rachel Adams. Rachel was not a typical maid, and she certainly didn't belong in a mafia stronghold. At 25, she was supposed to be finishing her residency in a top-tier audiology and neurotology program. But life had a cruel way of derailing plans. When her father passed away, he left behind a crippling mountain of debt owed to the Gallagher family, bitter rivals of the Morettis. To protect her younger sister from the Gallaghers' violent debt collectors, Rachel had to drop out of medical school and find fast off-the-books money. The Moretti family paid their discreet household staff exorbitantly well, provided they asked no questions and saw nothing. Rachel was hired through a shell company and assigned to the West Wing. Her duties were strictly confined to cleaning Leo's private quarters, organizing his massive library, and ensuring his meals were served on time. She was given one strict rule by the head housekeeper: never attempt to communicate with the young boss unless spoken to, and never look him directly in the eyes. But Rachel possessed a sharp, analytical mind, trained to observe the minutiae of human behavior and biology. Within her first week, she noticed things about Leo that didn't align with the medical narrative whispered among the staff. She observed him sitting in his study, bathed in the afternoon light, reading heavily redacted ledgers his father allowed him to review. She watched the way his head would faintly, almost imperceptibly, tilt toward the heavy oak door seconds before a guard knocked. She noticed how he reacted to the deep, low-frequency vibrations of thunderstorms closing his eyes, as if trying to grasp a fleeting memory of sound. One evening, while dusting the top shelves of his library, Rachel accidentally knocked a heavy bronze bookend off the edge. It plummeted to the thick Persian rug below with a dull, heavy thud. It wasn't a sharp noise, but it was impactful. Leo, seated at his desk with his back to her, flinched. It was a microscopic movement, a sudden stiffening of the shoulders, a rigid freeze of his spine. A person born profoundly dead, with zero auditory nerve function, would only react if they felt the vibration. But the rug had muffled the impact. The floorboards hadn't shaken. He had reacted to the air pressure of the sound wave. Rachel froze on her step stool, her heart hammering against her ribs. She watched as Leo slowly turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto hers. He didn't look startled by a vibration. He looked defensive. He signed something rapidly, his hands moving with fluid, angry grace. Rachel, who had learned basic ASL during her medical training to assist deaf patients, understood him perfectly. "Be careful." She nodded quickly, apologizing, and scrambled down to retrieve the bookend. As she hurried out of the room, her scientific curiosity flared into a blazing fire. She had studied hundreds of cases of profound, congenital deafness. Leo's reactions were wrong. His startle reflexes were wrong. The heir to the Moretti Empire wasn't entirely deaf. Or at the very least, his condition was not what everyone believed it to be. And Rachel, trapped in a house of killers, realized she had just stumbled upon a secret that could easily get her a bullet in the back of the head. The realization gnawed at Rachel over the next 2 weeks. She tried to keep her head down, scrubbing marble floors and polishing silver, but her eyes were always drawn back to Leo. He was a ghost, haunting his own life, a silent king, waiting for a crown he was never meant to wear. Rachel's medical instincts took over. She needed data. She needed proof. The opportunity presented itself when Vincent Moretti summoned the family's private physician, Dr. Aris Kensington, to the estate for Leo's annual mandatory checkup. Dr. Kensington was a smooth, polished man who smelled of expensive scotch and carried an aura of arrogant untouchability. After the examination, Dr. Kensington left his leather briefcase unattended in the drawing room while he stepped out to smoke a cigar with Uncle Oliver on the terrace. Rachel was in the adjacent dining room polishing glassware. Through the slightly ajar French doors, she could hear the low, gravelly hum of their voices. "The boy's condition remains stable," Oliver asked, his tone lacking any genuine concern. "Completely unchanged, Oliver," Dr. Kensington replied smoothly. "Just as we arranged. His auditory pathways are dormant. He's as deaf as a stone post. He will never be a threat to your succession." "Good," Oliver grunted. "Vincent is getting old Aris. He's getting soft. He still hopes a miracle will cure the boy so he can hand him the keys to the kingdom. But an empire like ours can't be run by a cripple. When the time comes, and it's coming soon, I need to know the boy won't be a complication." "He won't hear it coming, Oliver. You have my word. The original surgical records were incinerated 15 years ago. No one knows." Rachel's blood ran ice cold. She stopped polishing the glass, her breath hitching in her throat. Surgical records driven by a surge of reckless adrenaline, Rachel slipped into the drawing room. She approached the leather briefcase resting on the velvet armchair. The clasps were undone. With trembling fingers, she lifted the flap and sifted through the thick manila folders until she found one labeled Moretti L. She opened it. Inside were standard blood panels, EKGs, and a series of audiograms. Rachel's trained eyes scanned the audiograms. They were faked. She knew what a genuine flatline audiogram of a congenitally deaf patient looked like. These had inconsistencies in the bone conduction thresholds that a layman wouldn't spot, but a top-tier audiology student absolutely would. But it was the document underneath the audiograms that made her stomach drop. It was a faded, yellowed copy of a surgical invoice from a private clinic in Switzerland, dated 22 years ago. Procedure: bilateral cochlear implantation. Patient Leo Moretti. Age 4. Surgeon Dr. Aris Kensington. Rachel gasped silently, her hand flying to her mouth. Leo hadn't been born incurably deaf. He likely had a severe hearing loss, yes, but when he was 4 years old, someone, probably his mother who had died in a mysterious car crash shortly after, had secretly taken him to Switzerland for cochlear implants. The surgery implants an internal receiver and an electrode array directly into the inner ear. With an external sound processor attached to the outside of the head, a deaf person can perceive sound perfectly. But Leo didn't wear an external processor. He didn't even know he had the internal hardware. Dr. Kensington, likely bribed by Oliver over 2 decades ago, had performed the surgery, implanted the internal devices, but never activated them. He had never given the family the external processors. He had let Vincent believe the experimental surgery in Switzerland had failed, condemning the young boy to a lifetime of absolute silence to secure Oliver's eventual path to power. Rachel quickly snapped photos of the documents with her phone, carefully arranged the files exactly as she found them, and backed out of the room just as the heavy glass doors from the terrace began to slide open. Over the next few days, Rachel found herself watching Leo, not with curiosity, but with profound sorrow and a burning sense of justice. She noticed for the first time a faint, crescent-shaped scar, hidden perfectly behind his hairline right behind his ear when she handed him his morning espresso. It was the surgical entry point. The hardware was inside his skull, dormant, waiting for a signal it had never received. Oliver's words echoed in her mind, "When the time comes, and it's coming soon." Rachel realized that Oliver wasn't just planning to sideline Leo, he was planning a coup against Vincent. And because Leo couldn't hear the whispered plots in the hallways, the midnight phone calls, or the clink of weapons being loaded in the basement, he and his father were walking blindly into a slaughter. Rachel had a desperate choice to make. She could pack her bags in the dead of night, take the money she had saved, and disappear, leaving the Morettis to their bloody fate. Or she could intervene. If she intervened, she was stepping directly into the crossfire of a mafia war. But if she did nothing, the intelligent, isolated young man she had come to quietly respect would be murdered in his sleep. Her decision was made when she learned about the upcoming family gala. Vincent was hosting all the regional capos at the estate on Friday night to discuss territories. It was the perfect opportunity for Oliver to strike. He would have all his enemies in one room and the deaf heir isolated in his wing. Rachel needed an external processor. Specifically, she needed an obsolete, highly specialized MedTech Harmony 7 external transmitter, the only model compatible with the 22-year-old internal receiver mapped in Leo's chart. Risking everything, Rachel used her day off to travel into the city. She visited her old university, sneaking into the medical tech storage archives, using her old keycard, which miraculously hadn't been deactivated yet. She scoured the dusty bins of donated and obsolete audiology equipment. After 4 hours of frantic searching, her fingers brushed against a small, black, crescent-shaped device. A MedTech Harmony 7. She stole it along with a programming interface and a fresh set of high-voltage micro-batteries. Returning to the estate, she spent the night in her tiny servant's quarters, using her laptop to bypass the device's old software locks, formatting it to cast a wide, generalized frequency net. Because she couldn't properly map the device to Leo's specific auditory nerve responses without him present, she had to set it to an auto-adapt mode. It would be rough, it would be loud, and it would probably cause him a massive headache, but it would give him sound. Friday evening arrived. The estate was buzzing with a dark electric tension. Black SUVs rolled up the sweeping driveway, depositing hardened men in tailored suits. Downstairs, the clinking of glasses and the low hum of dangerous men plotting filled the grand ballroom. Upstairs in the West Wing, the silence was suffocating. At 8 p.m., the gala was in full swing. Rachel knew she had a very narrow window. The guards stationed at the end of Leo's hallway had been swapped out an hour earlier. The new guards weren't Vincent's loyal men. Rachel recognized them as Oliver's enforcers. The coup was happening tonight. Rachel slipped her cleaning cart out of the closet. She hid the programmed external processor, its magnetic coil, and the batteries inside a folded stack of fresh towels. Her hands were shaking so violently she had to grip the handle of the cart until her knuckles turned white to steady herself. She pushed the cart down the long, carpeted corridor, nodding submissively to Oliver's guards. They barely glanced at her, dismissing her as part of the furniture. She unlocked the heavy oak door to Leo's private suite and slipped inside, locking it behind her. The room was dark, illuminated only by the glow of the desk lamp and the moonlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Leo was standing by the window, staring down at the arriving cars. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up, revealing strong forearms. He sensed her presence immediately, the shift in the air pressure of the room. He turned his brow, furrowing in confusion and immediate irritation. It was past the hour for the staff to be in his quarters. He raised his hands, signing sharply. "What are you doing here? Get out!" Rachel left the cart by the door. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small notepad and a thick black marker. She wrote in large, frantic letters and held it up for him to see. "Your Uncle Oliver is going to kill your father tonight. His men are outside your door." Leo stared at the pad. His eyes darkened, a dangerous, lethal energy suddenly radiating from him. He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides, grabbing her by the arm. His grip was like a vice. He glared down at her, his lips moving silently, forcing her to read them. "Who are you? Who sent you?" Rachel shook her head wildly. She grabbed her pen and scribbled again. "I can prove it. You have to trust me. You were not born deaf." Leo froze. He looked at the words, then up at her face. For a fraction of a second, the hardened mafia air cracked, revealing a deeply ingrained lifelong pain. Then his expression hardened into fury. He thought she was playing a cruel, sick joke. He pointed forcefully toward the door, a clear command to leave before he threw her out himself. Rachel stood her ground. She dropped the notepad. Reaching into the folds of the towels on her cart, she pulled out the MedTech Harmony 7. Leo's eyes darted to the object in her hand. It looked like a sleek, black earpiece connected by a thin wire to a flat, circular magnet. He had never seen one before, but the medical nature of the device was obvious. He stepped back, defensive. Rachel stepped forward. She placed her hand gently over her own heart, looking him dead in the eyes, silently pleading. She brought her hands up, signing, clumsily but deliberately. "Please, let me help you." Dr. Kensington lied. "You have an implant." Leo shook his head, his breathing growing shallow. This was madness. He had been deaf his entire life. He remembered the endless, silent doctor's appointments, his father's defeated sighs that he could only see, not hear. Moving slowly, telegraphing her intentions so he wouldn't attack her, Rachel reached up. She brushed the dark, thick hair away from the space behind his right ear. Leo tensed his jaw, clenching, but he didn't pull away. He was paralyzed by the sheer audacity of this maid. Rachel found the faint surgical scar. She felt the slight ridge of the skull where the internal magnetic receiver was buried, just beneath the skin. "Here goes nothing," she whispered aloud, knowing he couldn't hear her. She took the external processor and hooked it over the top of his ear. Then she took the circular magnetic coil and hovered it over the scar. With a soft metallic click, the magnet snapped onto his head, connecting seamlessly through his skin with the dormant receiver inside his skull. Leo flinched at the physical sensation of the magnet snapping into place, reaching a hand up as if to tear it off. Rachel quickly pressed the power button on the processor. The small LED light on the device flashed green. For 22 years, Leo Moretti's auditory nerve had been starved, wrapped in a blanket of total unyielding silence. In a fraction of a millisecond, that blanket was ripped away by a violent digital explosion of electrical signals. Leo collapsed to his knees with a choked, agonizing gasp. His hands flew to the sides of his head. His eyes went wide, pupils dilating in absolute terror and shock. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't a symphony. It was a chaotic, overwhelming assault of sensory data. He heard the deep, rhythmic, terrifying thumping of his own heart. He heard the high-pitched electric hum of the desk lamp. He heard the rustle of his own clothes as he hit the floor. He squeezed his eyes shut, letting out a raw, guttural groan, overwhelmed by the sheer violence of sound. He reached for the magnet to pull it off, desperate to return to the safety of the dark silence he knew. Rachel dropped to her knees beside him. She grabbed his wrists, stopping him. "Leo!" she shouted. Leo gasped, his eyes flying open. He stared at her. His chest heaved. He had seen people move their lips his entire life. He knew what speech looked like. But now the movement of her lips was paired with something else. A vibration in the air. A frequency. A voice. It was distorted, tinny, and robotic because his brain hadn't mapped the digital signals properly yet, but it was undeniably a human voice. "Leo, look at me," Rachel said again, speaking loudly and clearly over-articulating, so his lip-reading could anchor the chaotic sounds he was processing. "Focus on my lips. Focus on my voice." Leo stared at her, tears of sheer sensory overload welling in his dark eyes. His hands were shaking violently in hers. He opened his mouth, his throat working clumsily as he forced his vocal cords to push air in a way he had never been able to monitor before. I. His own voice sounded monstrous to him, deep and gravelly and entirely unfamiliar. It vibrated in his chest and exploded in his head. "You can hear me," Rachel said, her own tears spilling over. "They lied to you, Leo. Your uncle paid the doctor to hide this from you, because a deaf heir couldn't lead the family." The shock on Leo's face began to recede, rapidly replaced by a terrifying cold realization. The puzzle pieces of his entire isolated life slammed together with deafening clarity. The patronizing smiles of his uncle, the sneers of his cousin, the tragic protective sorrow of his father. It was all built on a massive, calculated betrayal. Suddenly, a new sound pierced the room. It was sharp. It was heavy. It was coming from the hallway outside his door. Clack, clack. Leo's head snapped toward the heavy oak door. He had never heard the sound of a pump-action shotgun being racked before, but his survival instincts, honed in the mafia underground, recognized the lethal intent behind the mechanical noise. "Did you hear that?" Rachel whispered, her eyes wide with terror. Leo slowly stood up. The disorienting shock of hearing was fading, immediately overpowered by a cold, calculating rage. The silent victim was gone. The heir to the Moretti empire had just woken up. He looked at Rachel, his jaw set like granite. He didn't need to sign this time. He forced the words out his voice, rough, unused, but carrying the unmistakable authority of a don. "Get behind me." He walked over to his massive oak desk. He reached underneath, feeling for the hidden biometric lock. A hidden drawer slid open, revealing a suppressed matte black Heckler & Koch USP tactical pistol. Leo pulled the slide back. Click-clack. The sound of his own weapon loading was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. The heavy oak door of Leo's suite splintered inward with a deafening crash that sent a shockwave of raw, uncalibrated acoustic data straight into Leo's newly awakened brain. The MedTech Harmony 7 processor, squealed a sharp burst of feedback echoing in his skull, but adrenaline and years of repressed rage overrode the sensory overload. Two of Oliver's enforcers, heavily built men wearing cheap tactical vests over their tailored suits, spilled into the room. One carried the pump-action Mossberg 500 shotgun Leo had heard racking from the hallway. The other raised a standard-issue Glock 19. They expected to find a helpless deaf man cowering in confusion. Instead, they found the heir to the Moretti Empire waiting for them in the shadows, his eyes burning with lethal intent. Before the first man could fully level his shotgun, Leo raised the suppressed heckler and Coke USP. Foot, foot. The sound of the suppressed gunfire was unlike anything Leo could have conceptualized, a sharp metallic cough, rather than the cinematic boom he might have imagined. The first enforcer dropped, clutching his throat, his shotgun clattering against the Brazilian mahogany floorboards with a heavy wooden thud. The second man froze his brain, failing to process how the deaf target had anticipated their breach so perfectly. It was a fatal hesitation. Leo fired twice more. The man crumpled backward into the corridor. The room plunged into a terrifying, ringing silence, save for the ragged, heavy breathing of Rachel crouching behind the desk. Leo lowered the weapon, his hand trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the absolute inundation of his senses. He could hear the brass casings ringing out like tiny, high-pitched bells as they rolled across the floor. He could hear the low, mechanical hum of the central air conditioning unit vibrating through the ceiling grates. Most overwhelmingly, he could hear his own heartbeat drumming a frantic, frantic rhythm in his ears. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. He turned to Rachel. She was staring at him, her dark eyes wide, her hands clamped over her mouth to stifle a scream. "Are you injured?" Leo asked. His own voice startled him again. It was a deep, gravelly baritone, rough around the edges from a lifetime of disuse. Because the external processor wasn't perfectly mapped to his cochlea by a trained audiologist, his pitch control was slightly off, but the raw, commanding power of his tone was undeniable. Rachel dropped her hands and shook her head furiously. No, I'm okay." Her voice, high and trembling, reached him through a slight layer of digital static. It was the sweetest sound he had ever heard. "We need to move," Leo said, his enunciation slow and deliberate. He walked over to the desk, grabbed a spare magazine, and slammed it home. "My father is downstairs. Oliver is going to kill him. How many men are outside?" I don't know," Rachel stammered, scrambling to her feet. "They swapped the guard rotation an hour ago. All of Vincent's loyalists were moved to the perimeter. Oliver's men control the interior of the mansion." Leo's jaw clenched. He reached up his fingers, brushing against the cold plastic of the medtech processor, resting behind his ear, then pressing against the magnetic coil sticking to his skull. It felt incredibly vulnerable. If this device fell off, he would be plunged back into the dark, silent abyss he had known his entire life. "Stay right behind me," Leo ordered, stepping over the bodies at the threshold. "If anything happens, you run to the East Wing stairwell. There is a panic room behind the library bookcase. The code is 0427. "Do you understand?" "I'm not leaving you," Rachel said, fiercely surprising herself. She wasn't a mobster. She was an Ivy League-educated medical dropout, trying to pay off a debt. But looking at the fierce, unbroken man in front of her, a man she had just dragged out of a lifelong prison of silence, she knew she couldn't abandon him. "The device's battery life is unstable. I bypassed the firmware. It could surge or it could die. You need me." Leo looked at her for a long, calculating second. He saw the fire in her eyes. He nodded once. They moved out into the long, carpeted corridor. The mansion was vast, a sprawling architectural marvel, built by his grandfather in the 1980s. As they crept toward the grand staircase, the sounds of the house washed over Leo in disorienting waves. He could hear the ticking of the antique grandfather clock at the end of the hall. He could hear the faint, muffled strains of classical music, Vivaldi's Winter, drifting up from the grand ballroom 3 floors below. Suddenly, Leo threw his arm out, pressing Rachel flat against the silk-lined wall. He closed his eyes, concentrating. "What is it?" she whispered. "Footsteps." He breathed, his brow furrowing. Heavy boots, coming up the secondary stairs. For 22 years, Leo had relied on feeling the vibrations of footsteps through the floorboards. But these footsteps were distant, on a different floor entirely. He was hearing the acoustic echoes bouncing up the marble stairwell. The realization of his tactical advantage hit him like a jolt of electricity. Oliver's men thought they were hunting a ghost who couldn't hear them coming. They were completely exposed. Leo pulled a small silver mirror from his pocket, a tool he had used for years to see around corners without exposing himself. He angled it down the hallway. 3 men were sweeping the corridor, moving systematically toward his suite. He didn't wait for them. Stepping out from cover, Leo utilized the element of absolute surprise. He moved with the fluid, deadly grace of a predator, firing 3 rapid, suppressed shots. The sharp "fut-fut-fut" echoed in his ears, followed by the heavy, meaty thuds of bodies hitting the carpet. Rachel hurried up behind him, her breath catching as she looked at the fallen men. "Downstairs," Leo said coldly, his eyes fixed on the distant glow of the chandeliers at the bottom of the grand staircase. "It's time my uncle and I had a talk." The grand ballroom of the Moretti estate was a masterclass in opulent intimidation. Crystal chandeliers imported from Murano hung from the frescoed ceilings, casting a warm, golden glow over the long mahogany table that dominated the room. At the head of the table sat Vincent Moretti, his silver hair slicked back, a custom-tailored Brioni suit draped perfectly over his aging but broad shoulders. Around the table sat the highest-ranking capos of the Moretti syndicate, along with representatives from the 5 allied families. The air was thick with the scent of expensive Cohiba cigars, roasted garlic from the catering, and the underlying metallic tension of powerful men in a confined space. Sitting to Vincent's immediate right was his brother Oliver. Oliver was a leaner, sharper version of Vincent, his eyes constantly darting his smile, never quite reaching his eyes. Across from Oliver sat Dr. Aris Kensington, swirling a glass of Macallan, 25-year Scotch, looking entirely too relaxed for a civilian in a room full of killers. Vincent raised his glass of Dom Perignon, tapping it lightly with a silver spoon. The ringing sound commanded immediate silence. "My friends, my brothers," Vincent began his voice, a gravelly rumble that commanded absolute respect. "We gather tonight to solidify our borders. The ports in Brooklyn, the supply lines through New Jersey, they remain ours. But we face a time of transition. I am not getting any younger." A respectful murmur rippled through the table. Vincent's eyes darkened with a heavy familiar sorrow. "You all know of my son, Leo. You know of his condition. It breaks my heart every day that he cannot sit at this table and hear the wisdom of this family. Because of this tragedy, I have made a difficult decision regarding the succession." Oliver leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with barely concealed triumph. He slowly slipped his right hand beneath his suit jacket, resting his fingers on the grip of his revolver. Around the perimeter of the room, 6 of Oliver's hand-picked guards imperceptibly shifted their stances, their hands moving toward their holstered weapons. "Vincent!" Oliver interrupted, his voice dripping with faux sympathy. "You don't need to burden yourself. We all know the boy is broken. A deaf Don is a dead Don. The syndicate needs strong leadership. It needs hearing, seeing, capable blood." Vincent frowned, turning to look at his brother. I am not finished speaking, Oliver. Actually, brother, you are, Oliver sneered. He drew his weapon. In a synchronized, terrifying display of betrayal, Oliver's 6 guards drew their submachine guns, leveling them directly at Vincent and the loyalist capos. The room erupted into chaos as chairs scraped back and men shouted, but they were hopelessly outgunned. Oliver had planned the ambush perfectly. Dr. Kensington didn't even flinch. He simply took another sip of his scotch, smiling tightly. What is the meaning of this, Oliver? Vincent roared his face, turning a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. He stared down the barrel of his brother's gun, completely unafraid. It means your time is up, old man, Oliver said, standing up. You've gone soft, holding out hope for a miracle that was never coming. I am taking control of the family. Tonight. My men are upstairs dealing with your useless cripple of a son as we speak. It's nothing personal, Vincent. It's just business. You touch one hair on his head, and I will tear your heart out with my bare hands. Vincent snarled his voice, vibrating with lethal fury. He won't even hear the bullet that kills him, Oliver mocked. Suddenly, a voice rang out from the grand balcony overlooking the ballroom. You talk too loud, Uncle. The entire room froze. Every head, including Oliver's, snapped upward. Standing at the top of the sweeping marble staircase was Leo Moretti. He looked like an avenging angel bathed in the shadows. In his right hand, the HKUSP was gripped with casual, terrifying proficiency, and resting behind his right ear, distinctly visible in the glow of the chandelier, was a black, glowing medtech earpiece. Oliver's mouth dropped open. The color drained completely from his face. What? What is this? Vincent gasped, taking a stumbling step forward, ignoring the guns pointed at him. Leo, did you just speak? Leo descended the first few steps, his movements slow and deliberate. Every footstep echoed in his ears, the collective gasps of the mobsters, the clinking of ice in glasses, the terrified, jagged breathing of Dr. Kensington. He heard it all processing the symphony of the room like a supercomputer. He spoke farther, Leo said, his voice echoing through the cavernous ballroom. He looked directly at Dr. Kensington, who had turned a ghastly shade of pale, the Scotch glass trembling violently in his hand. And more importantly, I can hear. Rachel stepped out from the shadows behind Leo, holding up her phone. Dr. Aris Kensington. Leo continued, his voice cold as liquid nitrogen, chief of otolaryngology at Mount Sinai Hospital. 22 years ago, you took a 4-year-old boy into a private clinic in Zurich. You implanted a bilateral cochlear receiver into his skull, and then you took a bribe from my uncle to never activate it. You condemned me to a lifetime of silence, so this rat could one day steal my father's throne. Pandemonium broke loose. Vincent stared at Dr. Kensington, his expression twisting from shock into a mask of pure, unfiltered murder. It's a lie, Oliver screamed, panic finally cracking his arrogant facade. He's bluffing. Kill him! Kill them both! Oliver's guards swung their weapons toward the balcony, but Leo was already moving. He didn't just have the high ground. He had the element of supreme acoustic awareness. Before the first guard could pull the trigger on his MAC-10, Leo fired twice. The guard pitched forward over the mahogany table, shattering crystal glasses and sending a spray of Dom Perignon into the air. Get down! Leo roared to Rachel, shoving her violently behind the thick marble balustrade. The ballroom erupted into a deafening roar of automatic gunfire. The sound was agonizing. The uncalibrated processor clipped the high-decibel gunshots, sending sharp spikes of white-hot pain directly into Leo's auditory nerve. He gritted his teeth, blinking away tears of acoustic agony, and fired back. Downstairs, Vincent's loyal capos, realizing they had a fighting chance, flipped the heavy mahogany table over, using it as a massive barricade. They drew their concealed weapons and returned fire on Oliver's men. The air filled with the smell of cordite, pulverized marble and blood. Leo moved along the balcony like a phantom, using the marble pillars for cover. His new sense of hearing, though painful, was an incredible tactical asset. He could hear the distinct click-clack of an empty magazine hitting the floor. He knew exactly when an enemy was reloading. He popped out from behind a pillar, dropping a second enforcer, just as the man tried to slam a fresh clip into his submachine gun. "Leo!" Rachel screamed over the din of the gunfire. He spun around. Oliver's son, Anthony, the cousin who had mocked him for years with cruel, silent sneers, had slipped up the back servant stairs and was rushing down the balcony toward them, a silver Beretta 92 FS raised and aimed directly at Rachel's back. Anthony had always assumed Leo was completely oblivious to his surroundings unless he was looking directly at him. He didn't realize the rules had changed. Leo didn't even have to look. He heard the heavy squeaking sole of Anthony's Italian leather loafers on the marble. He heard the friction of the fabric as Anthony raised his arm. Leo pivoted on his heel, his arm extending in one fluid, unbroken motion. He didn't aim for center mass. He shot Anthony cleanly through the right shoulder. Anthony screamed a high, pitiful sound as the Beretta flew from his grip. He collapsed onto the balcony, clutching his bleeding shoulder, writhing in pain. Leo walked over to him, looking down at his cousin, with eyes entirely devoid of pity. "You always thought I was stupid, Anthony," Leo said, his deep voice slicing through the ringing in his ears. "I wasn't stupid. I was just waiting." Suddenly, a massive explosion of marble dust showered over Leo as a bullet chipped the pillar inches from his head. He ducked, dragging Rachel further down the balcony. Down below, the battle was turning. Vincent, armed with a heavy .45 caliber Colt, M1911 had personally put 2 bullets into the chest of Oliver's lead guard. But Oliver, desperate and cornered, had grabbed Dr. Kensington by the collar, dragging the weeping doctor backward toward the heavy iron doors that led to the gardens. "Cover me!" Leo yelled down to his father's men. He vaulted over the marble balustrade, dropping 15 feet and landing in a crouch on the shattered remains of the catered buffet. He rolled off the table, ignoring the stinging cuts from broken glass, and sprinted toward the garden doors. Oliver shoved Dr. Kensington backward, using the doctor as a human shield, and leveled his revolver at Leo. "It doesn't matter," Oliver screamed, his face spattered with blood and sweat. "You're still a freak, Leo. A machine in your head doesn't make you a real Don." "Let him go, Oliver!" Vincent's voice boomed from behind Leo. The old Don walked forward, his gun aimed steadily at his brother's head. "It's over." Oliver's eyes darted between Vincent and Leo. He knew he had lost the room. He knew his coup had failed. In a final spiteful act of cowardice, he shoved Dr. Kensington into Leo's path and swung his revolver toward Vincent. He never got the shot off. The sound of Leo's suppressed HK and Vincent's roaring Colt echoed in perfect, terrifying unison. Both bullets found their mark. Oliver staggered backward, the revolver slipping from his fingers. He looked down at the dark stains blooming on his white shirt, looked up at the brother and nephew he had betrayed, and crumpled to the floor, dead. The echo of the final gunshots faded, leaving only the groans of the wounded and the hiss of a ruptured water pipe in the walls. Leo stood in the center of the carnage, his chest heaving. The adrenaline was beginning to crash, leaving him hyper-aware of the painful, uncalibrated static buzzing in his ear. He felt a soft, trembling hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Rachel standing there. Her maid's uniform was torn and covered in plaster dust, but her eyes were shining with a mixture of terror and awe. "You did it," she whispered, her voice reaching him through the digital haze. Before Leo could respond, Vincent approached. The terrifying mafia boss looked older in that moment, his shoulders sagging, tears streaking his weathered face. He looked at the glowing black device resting behind his son's ear, then up into Leo's eyes. Vincent reached out a shaking hand, gently touching the side of Leo's face. "Leo." Vincent choked out his voice, thick with 22 years of guilt and grief. "My boy, my son, can you truly hear me?" Leo looked at his father. For the first time in his life, he didn't have to read the shape of the words on his father's lips. He could hear the tremor in his voice, the deep, resonant timbre of his love, the agonizing regret. "Loud and clear, father," Leo replied softly. Vincent pulled his son into a crushing, desperate embrace, burying his face in Leo's shoulder. As his father wept, Leo looked over his shoulder at Rachel. The brilliant, desperate woman who had broken into his silent prison had completely upended his world. She had given him back his life, his senses, and his empire. As the surviving capos began to secure the room, and the sirens of distant bribed police cruisers began to wail in the Long Island night, Leo knew one thing with absolute certainty. Rachel Adams was never going back to being a maid, and whatever dark, violent future awaited the Moretti family, she would be standing right by his side to navigate it. The sun rose over the Moretti estate, casting a cold, pale light on a fortress that had been fundamentally altered overnight. The sprawling, manicured lawns were quiet, but inside the mansion, an army of loyal cleaners worked feverishly. The heavy scent of industrial bleach and ammonia waged a losing war against the lingering copper stench of blood in the grand ballroom. The physical scars of Uncle Oliver's failed coup would take weeks to repair, but the psychological shift in the family's power dynamic was instantaneous. Upstairs, in the heavily fortified master study of the West Wing, the silence had finally been broken. Leo sat on the edge of a massive leather sofa, his elbows resting on his knees. The dark bags under his eyes spoke of a sleepless night, yet he possessed an electric, terrifying vitality that had never been there before. He was no longer a ghost haunting his own life. Sitting directly across from him, cross-legged on the matching ottoman, was Rachel. She had traded her blood-spattered maid's uniform for a pair of tailored slacks and a soft cashmere sweater borrowed from the estate's guest wardrobe. On the coffee table between them sat her battered laptop, a tangled web of wires connecting the computer to the MedTech Harmony 7 processor resting behind Leo's ear. "Tell me when the pitch becomes intolerable," Rachel said softly, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She adjusted a slider on the antiquated software interface. Leo winced slightly, his broad shoulders tensing as a sharp, digital whine echoed in his skull, followed immediately by the rustle of the oak trees outside the window, a sound so complex and layered it nearly brought tears to his eyes. "Down a fraction," he rumbled, his deep baritone vibrating in the quiet room. "The high frequencies, they feel like glass." Rachel tapped a key. "How about now?" Leo slowly opened his eyes. He looked at her, truly absorbing the sound of her voice without the distraction of gunfire or imminent death. It was melodic, rich, and distinctly hers. He didn't need to read her lips anymore, though his eyes still instinctively tracked them. "It's perfect," Leo murmured. He reached out his large, calloused hand, gently wrapping around her wrist, stopping her from typing. "You need to rest, Rachel. You've been awake for 36 hours playing neuroengineer for a mafia family. If the mapping isn't stable, the feedback loop could cause permanent nerve damage," Rachel countered, though she didn't pull her hand away. The warmth of his grip was grounding. "I need to contact a black market audiologist in the city. We need to get you a modern, top-tier processor. This Harmony 7 belongs in a museum. We will, Leo said, his thumb lightly tracing the pulse at her wrist. But right now, I need you to listen to me. Yesterday you were a maid, trying to pay off your father's gambling debts to the Gallaghers. Today, you are the woman who saved the Moretti Empire. My father wants to give you $1 million in untraceable bonds and a private jet to anywhere in the world. Rachel's breath hitched. $1 million. It was more than enough to pay off the Gallagher syndicate, put her sister through college, and start a new life. It was the escape hatch she had prayed for. She looked at the door, then back at Leo. Is that what you want? Do you want me to leave? Leo's dark eyes locked onto hers, an intense, possessive fire burning in their depths. The mafia prince who had lived in isolation had finally found his tether to the world, and he had no intention of letting it go. I want you to stay, he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper that sent a shiver down her spine. I want you by my side. You see the world the way I do. You see the truth beneath the lies. But the choice is yours. I will not trap you in this life if you want to run. Before Rachel could answer, the heavy oak doors to the study swung open. Vincent Moretti stepped inside, flanked by his two most trusted battle-hardened capos. The old Don looked exhausted, but his posture was iron straight. Leo, Vincent said, his eyes flicking to Rachel with a newfound, profound respect. We have a situation. Leo stood up, his imposing height dominating the room. The Gallaghers. Vincent nodded grimly. Word of the shootout leaked. The street knows Oliver made a move, and they know the house was shot to pieces. Declan Gallagher thinks we are bleeding out. He just called a mandatory sit-down. He wants to meet this afternoon at the neutral shipping yards in Brooklyn. He is going to demand territory, Leo. He thinks I'm weak, and he still thinks you are deaf. A slow, predatory smile spread across Leo's face. For 22 years, his perceived weakness had been a source of shame. Now it was the greatest tactical weapon in the state of New York. Let him think it, Leo said coldly. He turned to Rachel. Do you know standard American Sign Language syntax? Of course, Rachel replied, standing up. I used it with you for weeks. Good. Put your maid's uniform back on. You're coming with us. The Brooklyn shipping yards were desolate, wrapped in the grey fog rolling off the East River. Inside a hollowed-out warehouse, a long metal table had been set up. On one side sat Declan Gallagher, a massive, bearded man with a reputation for unspeakable cruelty, flanked by 4 heavily armed enforcers. The heavy metal doors groaned open, and the Moretti family arrived. Vincent walked in first, looking every bit the aging king. Beside him walked Leo, his face an unreadable stoic mask. His hair was styled slightly longer on the right side, perfectly concealing the black medtech processor behind his ear. Trailing just a half step behind Leo was Rachel, dressed in her modest maid's uniform, head bowed, playing the role of the submissive, terrified servant. They took their seats. Declan Gallagher leaned back in his creaking metal chair, lighting a cigar. He sneered at Vincent, then cast a look of utter pity at Leo. Vincent! Declan boomed, his voice echoing off the corrugated steel walls. It's a tragedy what happened last night. Brother turning against brother. The Moretti family is broken. The streets are chaotic. I'm here to offer stability. Vincent folded his hands on the table. And what does your stability cost, Declan? The South Side ports. All of them, Declan said smoothly. He glanced at Leo, then waved his hand dismissively. And I see you brought the deaf boy, still dragging him around like a mascot, Vince. When are you going to realize a cripple can't inherit a throne? Leo didn't blink. He stared blankly at Declan's chest, playing the part flawlessly. Rachel lifted her hands, rapidly signing to Leo. "He is insulting you. He wants the South Ports." Leo signed back, his face blank. "Tell my father to refuse him." Rachel turned to Vincent. "Mr. Moretti, your son, says to decline the offer?" Declan laughed, a harsh, barking sound. He leaned in closer to the table, maintaining eye contact with Vincent. But as he did, he tilted his head slightly to his right, murmuring under his breath to his towering underboss, assuming his words were safely masked by the cavernous echoes of the warehouse. "Get the men ready," Declan whispered so quietly even Vincent couldn't hear it from across the table. "When we leave, hit their northern supply trucks. Kill the drivers. Tonight we take the old man out at his estate. We'll leave the deaf kid alive to sign over the assets." It was the ultimate betrayal of a mafia parley. Across the table, Leo's eyes slowly tracked from Declan's chest up to his face. The Medtech Harmony 7, tuned perfectly to capture human vocal frequencies, by Rachel picked up Declan's whispered treachery with crystal clarity. Leo leaned forward, resting his forearms on the cold metal table. The air in the warehouse suddenly dropped 10 degrees. The blank, vacant stare vanished, replaced by the lethal, calculating glare of an apex predator. "You aren't hitting the northern trucks, Declan Lickhorse." Leo spoke. His deep, resonant voice shattered the silence of the warehouse like a bomb going off. Declan Gallagher froze, the cigar slipping from his lips and tumbling onto the table. His underboss gasped, stepping back in sheer shock. Vincent didn't move, a cold smirk playing on his lips. "And Leo continued his enunciation, slow, perfect, and terrifying. "You will not be visiting my estate tonight, because you are not leaving this warehouse." What is this?" Declan stammered, staring at Leo in utter disbelief. You can hear. I hear everything," Leo whispered. Before Declan could reach for the weapon inside his coat, Leo raised his right hand and snapped his fingers. The sharp acoustic crack echoed loudly. Instantly, the shadows in the rafters above them moved. 10 of Vincent's elite snipers who had infiltrated the warehouse 3 hours prior switched on the laser sights of their rifles. 10 red dots appeared instantly on the chests and foreheads of Declan and his men. Declan slowly raised his hands, his face draining of blood. He had walked blindly into a slaughter. Leo stood up, towering over the table. He walked slowly around the metal surface until he was standing directly behind Rachel. He placed his large hands gently on her shoulders. "There is one more piece of business, Declan," Leo said, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "Thomas Adams owed you a debt of $400,000, a debt you have violently leveraged against his daughters." Declan swallowed hard, looking at the maid in terror. It's forgiven. The debt is cleared. Consider it a tribute to the new Don. It was already cleared the moment she walked into my home, Leo corrected him coldly. But you needed to understand who she belongs to. If anyone in your family ever looks in her direction again, I won't just take your ports. I will erase the Gallagher name from the earth. Do we understand each other?" "Yes." Declan croaked, his eyes fixed on the red laser dot hovering between his eyes. "Yes, Don Moretti." Leo looked down at Rachel. The terrified maid was gone. In her place sat a woman who possessed the intellect to outsmart doctors, the courage to walk into a firefight, and the heart to save a man the world had written off. She looked up at him, her dark eyes shining with a fierce, unbreakable loyalty. Leo held out his hand. Rachel took it, her fingers intertwining with his. As they walked out of the warehouse, leaving the ruins of their enemies behind them, the heavy metal doors clanged shut. The sound was loud, sharp, and violent. But to Leo Moretti, walking into the sunlight with the woman who had shattered his silence, It was nothing short of a masterpiece. What a massive twist. Rachel didn't just give Leo his hearing back. She gave him the power to become the most feared don in the city. From a desperate maid trying to clear a family debt to the untouchable queen of the Moretti Syndicate, her brave gamble changed everything. But do you think the Gallagher family will truly stay quiet, or is this just the beginning of a much bigger mafia war? Let us know your wild theories in the comments below. If you loved this intense romance, smash that like button, share this video with your friends, and hit subscribe with notifications turned on so you never miss our next thrilling story.